where I've worked for probably, well, very close to 20 years now. And this project has been kind of on the corner of my desk for most of those years, kind of way off where I can barely reach it. But it's now getting a bit closer. I'd like to recognize that there are some members of council here tonight. There's Councillor Wallace Richmond, Mayor Nancy Cooper. I think I saw Councillor Ellen Harrison. And I'm not sure which other councillors are here. If you'd like to stand up, maybe. Councillor Tim Lavery. And there's a number of senior staff from the City of Salmon Arm that are here. There's Kevin Pearson over on the left, the Director of Development Services. There's Jennifer Wilson, our City Engineer. Monica Dalziel, our Chief Financial Officer. And my good friend, Mr. Mike Lavecchio, who's here from CP Rail. I'd like to point out that this is not a council meeting tonight. I think that's important to remember. And none of the staff up here are running for election in October, unless there's something I don't know, guys. But I can guarantee you that I'm not. So we're here really to try and explain the facts of this project and try to answer any questions that might come up. I'm probably going to talk for about 45 minutes and go through a PowerPoint presentation. And after that, we're going to open it up for questions with the podium that's right here. And we'll see how long that may go on. So without further ado, I'll talk about the project. What you're looking at up on the screen right now is a rendering that was done for the project, oh gosh, probably, I don't know, 15 or 16 years ago. And you can see, of course, that the Prestige Inn is not on the rendering. So there's a lot of changes that have occurred since then. This is a bird's eye view of the location of the Ross Street Underpass, which of course will be going in just on the east side of the Askew's parking lot, right to the heart of the waterfront area. This is a schematic of the site and what is there today. It shows much of the CP infrastructure that exists there today, including what's called a hot box set-off track and the siding east of the Marine Park Drive crossing. You'll hear me use a bit of the railroading jargon tonight, like hot box detector, for example. We've been forced to kind of learn some of that jargon over the past couple of years. And that's why I have Mr. Lavecchio here to maybe explain what some of that stuff means. So this, of course, is Ross Street looking north with the Prestige Inn in the background. And a picture on the right of the existing Marine Park crossing, which, as I'll speak to a bit later, is going to be closed to pedestrian and vehicular traffic if this project goes ahead. This is the limit of construction for the project, and I show this really just to demonstrate that it's a much larger construction area than just the underpass location itself. So there will be a bit of disruption that happens, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. This is a blow-up of the limit of construction. And this is an important slide because it shows that some of the changes that are going to occur with the underpass project. For example, Ross Street, north of the underpass, is going to have no parking on either side. And also on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there will be no parking on the north side of Harbourfront Drive. And why is that? It's because people that are going to be traveling to the waterfront, pulling boats and trailers, need room to pass. And with the parking that exists today, that simply is not possible. What we also show there on the bottom half is that the existing CP building is going to remain, and that is not part of this project. It's going to remain for the foreseeable future unless we come to some other agreement with CP Rail in the future. To do otherwise with that building would add a couple of $1 million to the project, and it's simply not something we're looking at right now because CP needs to have a building to maintain their operations. The bottom of the screen, you'll see that at the intersection of Lakeshore and Ross Street, that it's going to be a four-way intersection, and there's not going to be a traffic light at this time, although that may occur in the future. Just providing some more context about the project. The railroad was constructed a long, long time ago in 1885. And the concept for the Ross Street Underpass was developed in the early 1980s. So it's not a new idea. There are successive councils that have talked about it and endorsed it over the many years. It's going to provide improvements to safety and access to the waterfront. It's been included in the downtown revitalization plans of the city for many, many years. Of course, there have been several petitions over the years to City Council, both in favor and opposed to the project. And it has been somewhat of a divisive issue over the years. I'm often asked what alternatives have we looked at, and we've looked at many of them over the years. For example, 5th Street Southwest, 6th Street Northeast, Shuswap Street, and I'll speak to those just very briefly, that we have looked at many of them over the years. Some of them perhaps with not as much rigor as we've done with the Ross Street Underpass, because the more that you study these other alternatives, the more that you'll see that they're simply not feasible from an engineering or land acquisition or financing perspective, and that the Ross Street Underpass really is the only and the best option. For example, this is 5th Street, where we've looked at going over the Trans-Canada Highway. Of course, that's M&M Meats on the right-hand side. Some challenges with that location is that you would need to go over or under the Trans-Canada Highway and Lakeshore Road in order to get to the waterfront. It's really not feasible from an engineering perspective. And even if you were able to do that, on the north side you find BD Avenue, which is a bit substandard at that location. And you would end up trying to enter the waterfront from the western periphery, as opposed to going into the heart of the waterfront at Ross Street. We've looked at an overpass at 6th Street, which we looked at in 1987. The cost of that at that time was estimated at $1.7 million, but it's really not feasible from an engineering perspective. This is an example of what that alternative would entail. Of course, that's McGuire Lake on the right-hand side, and it's a very narrow local road. More importantly, though, there are major developments and major property acquisition that would be needed to go straight down across the tracks from there. And it's simply not feasible at this point in time. Yeah, there's also the issue of the aesthetic impact of what would likely be an overpass at that location. We looked at 10th Avenue, which is sort of down from the health unit, and that option does have some possibilities, but really 10th Avenue is a residential road at that location, and there would be major environmental impacts on the north side of Lakeshore Road. For example, that's where the Raven Trail is, and there's some environmentally sensitive areas. We've looked at 10th Street Southwest, but there are many challenges with that location. You can see it goes through, of course, Adams Lake Indian Band properties, and really there's no access to the waterfront even if you were able to get to the north side of the tracks. We've looked at Shoeswap Street, which also has some potential, but the grades don't really work there. There's poor access to the waterfront if you were able to get across. And again, there's major property issues that would need to be overcome. We've looked at 4th Street Northeast. Again, many challenges. For example, there's no real access to the waterfront if you were able to get over at that location. We did do some design work on the 4th Street overpass concept many years ago, but really didn't pursue it with much more rigor at that point because it's really simply not feasible. So the point of this is that we have looked at many alternatives and without fail come to the conclusion that Ross Street is the only option. This is a design concept that was done in 1987 for the Ross Street Underpass location. This was done by Gentech Engineering, and you can see it was $1.1 million, the estimate back then. So we should have done it then. This is just showing the location of the Ross Street Underpass. It's been in our official community plan, as I mentioned earlier, since the 1980s, really. And it's in our present official community plan, if you're one of those people that like to study that sort of thing. It's also in the city's corporate strategic plan, which was done a couple of years ago and endorsed by council. And as you'll see a bit later on, it's included as well in the city's long-term financial plan and debt strategy, and I'll speak a bit later as to what that means. This is the city's corporate strategic plan, which I'm guessing none of you in this room have looked at, but I could be wrong. And this shows at the top the short-term strategic priorities for the city. And where the red arrow is the Ross Street Underpass. So again, it's been endorsed many times by council and really is the last of our short-term goals or priorities from that strategic plan that has yet to be done. And we had projected that it would be done in 2018 when we did the strategic plan. This is showing the CP infrastructure that exists there today with the station. And talking about some details, if the project goes ahead, is a maintenance track is going to be provided for the project in Tappan. There's going to be what's called a 2-track shoe fly diversion, and that's the red lines that may be hard to see over on the right-hand side. So what it means is the tracks are going to be diverted around the construction area to allow the underpass to be built. And shoe fly is another one of those funny CP terms that Mike may speak to later. Hot box detector, that's a location that exists today where there's a set-off track where trains that are in trouble for mechanical reasons or troubles with or whatever it may be are able to get off the track and park so that CP can drive up with their vehicles and do whatever repairs need to be done. So there's a hot box set off track and detector there today, which is kind of close to Gibbons Motor Toys on the south side. And as you'll see a little bit later, that hot box set off track is going to be moved east of Marine Park Drive. The cost estimate for all of these things that are associated with construction is about $2.8 million. And that's one of the reasons, which we'll talk about a bit later, for the price tag of the project. This is an example of an underpass that's built in the city of Kamloops at First Avenue. And the vertical clearance is 4.1 meters. This is showing an example of public art that you see in Kamloops that's with the underpass. And also at the city of Kamloops, this location kind of goes down to the waterfront where the tennis courts and Riverside Park are located. And it's got a clearance of 4.3 meters. This is the city's relatively new underpass on the Trans-Canada Highway on 20th Street. And the clearance there is 5.1 meters. Now, if the project does not go ahead, there are a number of risks and implications for the city. For example, you may have read in the newspaper recently that Transport Canada, which is a federal organization and has sweeping powers in this sort of thing. But Transport Canada is telling us that there's a potential closure of Marine Park Drive and other crossings in the area if the underpass does not go ahead. There was a grade crossing assessment that the city completed at the request or demand, really, of Transport Canada, which was just finished a few months ago. And it has a big price tag associated with it, which I'll talk to a bit later. There's lots of other cities that are struggling with this issue right now, and Transport Canada has forced many of them to hire flaggers and to make traffic pattern changes at great expense. The report that I'm referring to also talks about the necessity to put in signalized intersections at Marine Park and Narcisse, which is, of course, the other level crossing west of here. And the price tag for that will be in excess of $1 million. And of course, we would be left without an underpass. Of course, there's the potential for a catastrophic accident at the Marine Park Drive crossing. Heaven forbid, but I've personally seen many close calls there over the years. The city has invested in the design of the project, and the cost, as I said earlier, has gone from $1.1 million in 1987 to about $12.3 million today. There has been a lot of property negotiations taking place over the past several years, which I've been indirectly involved in. And there's also the possibility, of course, that if we don't go ahead with the project now, that CP is going to change the requirements over time. The city has been successful in getting several grants for the project, which really are covering probably about 60% of the project, and we'll be at risk of losing those if we don't go ahead. We have an obligation to provide fencing and a pedestrian overpass at 17th Street out in Raven if the underpass does not go ahead. And I would say that's probably a moral obligation versus a legal one, but certainly CP is expecting us to do that if the underpass does not go ahead. Finally, we had a fire underwriters survey finished a few years ago, and that's a public document. And if you look at it, you'll see that it essentially says that without the underpass, the risk of effectively fighting fires is diminished north of the tracks, and that could have an impact on insurance rates going into the future. This is just a copy of the front page of the grade crossing assessment report, which I referred to earlier, which was done at the behest of Transport Canada. Some notable excerpts from that, which again is a public report and went to council some time ago. Essentially, grade crossings have to comply with the regulations by the year 2021, which is going to be a very, very expensive undertaking for the city. Yeah, I'll leave that at that for the time being. We're seeing lots of close calls on the tracks, which I mentioned earlier, but the issue really is that sometimes vehicles will park at the stop sign on the south side of the tracks, leaving their trailers hanging over the tracks. And obviously that's a real danger. These are the recommendations from that report. And you can see it talks about the requirement to put in signalized intersections. Again, another excerpt from the report, signalized intersections at Marine Park and Narcisse by the year 2021. A few examples of other cities that have had to make major changes to address Transport Canada requirements. For example, the city of Kamloops has had to hire flaggers to stand at the tracks day and night to the tune of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's despite the fact that you probably all know that Kamloops has a pedestrian overpass. But the fact is that some people don't use it because it's a longer walk and they cross illegally underneath it. And Transport Canada has required Kamloops to put flaggers there. The cost of maintaining the crossings that we have today is borne by the city of Salmon Arm, not by CP, because the city is essentially the owner, and as what's called the road authority, we're obligated to maintain those crossings. And you can see on the right-hand side, we have some major expenses coming up to do that, including at Marine Park to the tune of $120,000. If we complete the underpass project, that expense will go away. This is showing what's happened in Cloverdale in the city of Surrey. And again, this is because of Transport Canada requirements. And they have had to invest hundreds of thousands, $6.3 million in total to address those issues. This is in the city of White Rock, which of course has a beautiful waterfront. And because of Transport Canada requirements and no overpass or underpass, they're looking at simply closing off the waterfront. This is the design work that the city has looked at for a pedestrian overpass out in Raven that I talked about earlier at 17th Street, which we're going to have to do in the near future if the underpass does not go forward. And the price tag on that is about $3 million. This is an excerpt from the Fire Underwriters Survey, which I talked about earlier, which again is available. It's a public document, and it talks about increased risks of firefighting without an underpass. This was a media release that was done in 2007, which talks about the pedestrian overpass project at 17th Street in Raven. The city did this press release with Canadian Pacific, essentially committing to doing that project in the future. The design work for the project is at the 90% stage, and the consulting engineer is Binney and Associates, who are located in the Lower Mainland, and our experts in the field. Some important design elements about the project if it were to go ahead. The low point is 346.8 meters. All vehicles will be able to pass underneath, including transit buses, fire trucks, etc. Of course, pedestrians will be able to walk under the underpass, as well as cyclists. There's a potential for a public art component, and there are major stormwater improvements that are going to occur. This is just showing some of the details of the design, which obviously you can't read from where you're sitting, but just to demonstrate how far the design has proceeded. Landscaping, structural, stormwater. You'll see that green dot is a stormwater pump station, which will be installed with the project and provide major improvements to the storm infrastructure that's there, to the tune of about $630,000 for that part of the project alone. The storm sewer system is going to be relocated west of where it is today, because where it is today is exactly where the underpass will go. And the city has been actively securing the rights of way that are needed for that to occur. That area is subject to lots of water pooling. This particular photo is from spring of 2015, and I've seen this happen, every 3 to 4 years. But it happens because the city's stormwater system becomes overwhelmed in rainstorms in the spring mostly, and we get water pooling. The improvements that will occur with the pump station, etc., will help to rectify this situation. I'm not saying it's going to completely eliminate it, but it's certainly going to improve the situation. And the flooding that we see there in recent years, important to note, it's not from Shuswap Lake. It's from, as I said, the stormwater system being overwhelmed. If we get flooding in this area because of Shuswap Lake, then we have much bigger problems to deal with. And if the underpass has water from whatever source, then the city would simply put barricades up and close it down for a couple of hours while the storm system does its thing. There are lots of underpasses on the prairies which are flooded all the time. We've done lots of environmental work, including a hydrogeological assessment and an environmental assessment. You can see there's been lots of test holes that have been drilled. The cost of the project, you can see, is $12.368 million. That includes a 630,000 stormwater pump system that we talked about earlier. And as I said, the price has gone up over the years and is going to continue to escalate if we don't do the project. Project funding, as I said, the city has obtained funding for more than 50% from other sources, including the gas tax, Transport Canada, a generous contribution from CP Rail of $1 million, and long-term debt projected at $5.1 million, which I'll talk about a bit later. The long-term debt, $5.1 million, the debt servicing cost of that, in other words, what the city has to pay the bank back to borrow that money, is $316,000 a year. And there will be no tax increase to pay that money back. And how can I say that so confidently? It's because we have debt on the Shaw Center being retired or paid out in July of 2019. And the cost of doing that today is about $450,000 a year. So what we're going to do is simply use those funds to pay off the Ross Street Underpass instead. So it's, I like to say, baked into the city's financial cake already. These costs are subject to change, and I'll talk about that a bit later. This is what's called our long-term debt strategy. So the city council has looked at what debt the city is going to have going forward for many, many projects, which I'll talk about. But you'll see at the bottom, the debt servicing cost for the underpass will be $316,000 a year. And on the far right-hand side is the debt ratio of the city. And you can see, even with the underpass project, that is going to be decreasing to 46.5%. In other words, less than half of what the city is allowed to borrow at 40%, which is a very, very healthy ratio, and far below what most other cities in the province run at. Now, in order to do long-term borrowing of about $5.1 million, the city is going to be required to either do a referendum or conduct what's called an alternative approval process. And we're required by law to do that, as are all cities in the province. We can't incur debt without getting the approval of the electors in some way. provided that it's over a 5-year term. So if it takes more than 5 years to pay it back, we need to get approval of the electors. At this point, all signs are pointing to the fact that we're going to have a referendum in October of 2018 in conjunction with the local government election. Now that has not been finalized yet, and council still needs to ultimately vote on that course of action, but it's looking like that's what the city is going to do at this point. So it's going to be up to the residents of Salmon Arm whether or not this project happens. If it goes ahead, we're going to likely use what's called the traditional procurement process of design, tender, build. In other words, we design the project. Right now it's at 90%. It'll need to go to 100%. And we go out to tender with those drawings and enter into a contract with a contractor to build the project. There are other ways to do this, but this is the least risky method. Because once you enter into that contract, if the project goes over budget, it's at the risk of the contractor. Now, if we do have a referendum in October of this year, I'm often asked, is that a binding referendum or how does that work? Well, if more than 50% of the people vote in favor of borrowing the money, it doesn't mean that it's binding on City Council. Council could still vote against the borrowing bylaw, or the tender bids could come over budget and Council could decide not to go ahead with the project. So a yes vote is not binding. If less than 50% of the people vote in favor, it means that the city cannot go to long-term borrowing for those funds, and likely would mean the end of the project. Now, I would never say never, because there are other methods that council could use, but they're highly unlikely. If that happens, likely the project will be abandoned. The property negotiations that we've done over the past several years will fall apart because they're time sensitive. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to need to construct an overpass at 17th Street, and we're going to need to make all of the improvements that Transport Canada has set out for us, like signalized intersections at Marine Park and Narcisse. Finally, with funding partners, what that means is we're going to lose the grants that we have in place for the project. If the referendum is successful, we're going to complete the tender package, go through the process, and start construction in July of 2019. It'll take about a year and it'll be finished in the summer of 2020. And yes, there will be disruption to traffic and to the commercial businesses that are down there. But obviously we'll do our best to minimize that. Some other issues that are out there, for example, we're going to be building a new parkade at 4th Street, which of course is just southeast of the proposed underpass. And I think that's really an exciting thing for the city. It's going to mean that people can park in this parkade and within 3 to 4 minutes probably walk to Wednesday on the Wharf. I wanted to pause tonight just for a special recognition of Mr. Vic Bates, the late Vic Bates. Vic was a real visionary when it came to the waterfront in Salmon Arm, and he was a major proponent of this project. And him and I had many, many, many conversations about it. Vic was the sort of man who did things rather than talked about doing them. And that's a quality that I most admire in others, so I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge that. Talking about the city's long-term financial plan, this screenshot shows the capital projects that the city is committed to working on over the next 15 years or so. For example, the Street Underpass, with a project value of $12.4 million, debt of $5.1 million, debt ratio of 47%, and no tax increase needed to do it. And if you go down the list, you'll see all of the other exciting projects that we have. Hudson Avenue Revite, sponsoring the construction of a new tennis club, a downtown parkade, West Connector Trail, and you'll see that none of those projects have a tax increase associated with them, which is really an amazing thing. And it's a tribute to City Council and to Monica Dalziel, our Chief Financial Officer, sitting up here. So it's really an interesting document to have a look at. The one project that may have a tax increase is a new pool. You can see that's scheduled to happen in 2027, but there's still a lot of design work that's needed to move that along. The bottom of the list is a new track and field concept up where the existing public works yard is and beside the new proposed indoor tennis club. We're going to be having several open houses about the underpass project, which will be a different format from tonight. There won't be presentations, it'll be senior staff available to talk to you one-on-one about the project. And you can see those are scheduled for May, June, and August of this year. That concludes the presentation. I'd like to thank you. And as I said, we're prepared to take some questions. There's a podium with a microphone right in the center. So if you do have a question, I would encourage you to come up to the podium. And please help yourself to the tea and coffee at the back of the room. So any questions?
Carl, thanks for the thorough explanation. A couple of questions from me. I'm wondering the impact on the north and south side of the track according to buildings. What buildings would be impacted? And the other question is with the diversion during construction, what buildings will be impacted?
Well, in both cases, there will be no buildings impacted. For example, the CP station that is there today will not be impacted. And on the north side with the shoe fly diversion, there will be no buildings impacted. Although the city has been required to negotiate property to make that happen, no impact on buildings. Other questions?